What's going on, everybody? You've got the card board coach here with your boy, Coach Co. And team, today we've got a very special guest on the podcast here today. We've got Brad, a super collector in a specific niche that we haven't touched upon just yet. I'm super excited to have him. Brad, how are you doing today?
Hi, good morning. I appreciate you having me on and giving me an opportunity to talk about this unique hobby that's growing.
Yeah. So, Brad, we've connected several times at some of these big shows. I think it started at the Expo, and touched base again at the National. You were looking for some cool pieces, and when we started chatting, I was like, "This is a segment of the market that I think a lot of people collect, but they probably don't like know what direction to go in. Like maybe they don't have graded copies. Um, maybe they haven't really thought that some of these things have like true value, even though they have like some intrinsic value. And so I was like, you know what better way to explore this market than someone who's, kind of dived in head first.
Yeah, no doubt. I guess I'll give a little bit of background. So we're talking about graded magazines, and specifically the king of all of them is Sports Illustrated. But I got into this really in during the midst of the pandemic. When everybody was kind of looking for something to do. I had collected autographed Sports Illustrated since I was a kid. I grew up in the Bay Area in California. Used to run around getting autographs and doing all that, and I would always get them on Sports Illustrated. So I always thought it was kind of a unique thing. A lot of times, athletes were proud that they were on the cover, and so it was always fun. And then you grow out of that, and I had this collection just sitting in the basement. And during COVID, I started to hear about grading magazines, and it it evolved from the comic book world. And in comics, which I'm not very well versed in, but they've been grading for decades. But really, in the last 12 years, this graded magazine concept started to evolve. And then in the last 3 or 4 years, it's really exploded, and starting to garner a lot of attention. And so, I jumped in head first 3, 4 years ago, and haven't looked back. And as you mentioned, now I love going to shows and just seeing more and more of these items starting to show up. And it's a fun, unique niche. Very passionate group that is heavily involved with it. And I think also importantly, we're starting to see the values really start to skyrocket, especially in certain cases. So it's been fun to kind of get in relatively on the ground level and just see it grow in the last couple of years.
Yeah. So, and that's what I mean. You checked a lot of boxes for me. It was like someone who came in fairly early to that segment, someone who is kind of their taste has almost grown a little bit with the market.
Mhm.
Like I do really want to dive into like knowing when to buy, knowing when to sell, have you sold anything, things like that. But just like it's very unique where you have this opportunity where you can talk to someone who's passionate about a certain segment that really hasn't. I don't even think it's reached full maturation, whatever the hell that means. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, I think you can say that about like most of the segments, but this one specifically, if you see the explosion of in value that like type one photos have had even over the
Yeah.
course of the last like 3 to 5 years, more specifically in the last 1 2 years, like you just see how much room is there for a lot of these things. And I should also preface, like, we're not having this conversation in an effort to like inflate anything. We're just trying to show everyone that there are so many different segments of the market. And much like you, if you think something's undervalued and you really just like it's a beautiful opportunity for you to just
Yeah.
scoop up a bunch of pieces that you genuinely want to own.
Yeah, that's how I got into this 4 years ago. I love SI. I love what it represents. I think a lot of the covers, frankly, are works of art. I mean, the photography is second to none, and so I just started collecting things that I liked. And whether it was, I'm a big golf fan, and so
Yeah.
my goal was to try to get as many of the big golf covers as I could. I like baseball. I like basketball. And so that's where I kind of started doing this. And so I have, a pretty large collection in that space. But then in the last really, I'd say 12 to 18 months, you've started to see the values go up, and kind of the leaders in that, we call it the Mount Rushmore,
Yeah.
is Michael Jordan, Mickey Mantle in baseball, Wayne Gretzky in hockey, and Muhammad Ali in boxing. I mean, those are the king, top of the mountain. And so then it kind of became a mission of, let's try to go after those. And I do travel a lot, and so I love going antiquing. I love going to swap markets, and I've been very successful in finding a lot of hidden gems in that. And so I've been able to build out kind of the investment part of my hobby as well. But let me take a step back and just talk about the differences and what I'm looking for when, and what collectors are looking for. The biggest difference in magazines, is that there's newsstand and there's subscription, and it's night and day. And so newsstands, they don't have the little mailing label.
Yep.
Subscriptions are obviously ones that were mailed out to subscribers. So newsstands are infinitely more valuable. The guesstimate, I think, is there were anywhere from 7% of every issue was a newsstand. And
Wow.
so the rarity, is what drives the interest there. And so, that's where a lot of my focus is. And that's where a lot of the demand is, because it's just so rare to find a newsstand magazine, especially a vintage one that's in tremendous condition. And that's where you're starting to see more and more interest. And so, not to say that there are also subscription issues that are starting to see a lot more demand, especially, for that entry level person, or the
Yeah.
person that's maybe trying to test the waters. You're seeing some subscription issues also sell for quite a few bucks. So it's not to say just ignore those, but it all depends, and it's kind of in the eye of the beholder, and what people want to collect. But those are the two things, to I guess, to start out the conversation, that when we're talking newsstand, when we're talking subscription, that's kind of the line of demarcation when it comes to what drives the value. It's no different than a numbered card versus an unnumbered card, if
Yeah.
you're
Or
a
like a
card
pack, or
collector.
like a pack pulled card versus like one of the ones that are printed on demand. Like I, I think
100%.
I think the sports card community can kind of get behind that and understand that there's like a lot more value if the card is pack pulled generally, because that's how it was meant to be consumed
Yes.
almost. Do you know what I mean? Like, and that's
Yeah,
like,
100%.
yeah. So I want to dive into that. You do antiquing and stuff. You found some of these magazines while antiquing?
I have found most of my magazines antiquing. I have found them at different shows, flea markets. I've been very lucky. And it really took off 3 or 4 years ago. I was in South Dakota, where my wife is from, and we were antiquing, and I found an incredible collection, a full run, original subscriber from 1954 to 1990. And within that, yes, 90% of them were subscription, but within that, there were some absolute gems of newsstands that the person had collected. And that's what really kind of skyrocketed my collection, and allowed me to then, take some of those, sell them, and then that is then allowed me to really invest heavily, in other areas, over the last couple of years. So I've been there. And that's the fun part, is that we're in the infancy of this. So
Yeah.
I go into any antique mall, I go into any swap shop, and I'm able to find these. And as the word has gotten out, it's become more and more difficult. But that's part of the fun. It's the thrill of the hunt. It's, again, no different than buying a box of cards and hoping for the best. It's I
Yeah.
walk into a store and hope for the best. But I have been very lucky in finding most of my collection that way.
That is unbelievable. I mean, we talk a lot about arbitrage on the show, and it just goes to show that, like, in the right hands, under the right circumstances, just the difference in value from like, and that's what I think the collecting community really appreciates. Number one is obviously like the hunt, like you mentioned, is like just the experience. that you gain by going to all these shops and talking to
Yeah.
people and some of these like middle of nowhere flea markets that you probably meet like the most genuine people and one conversation turns into, oh, I actually have all this stuff, like
Yes.
come back tomorrow, or like maybe we can exchange information.
Yep.
I think that stuff is really genuine and really kind of adds to the experience. But then again, like I said, it is quite fascinating to see, just the difference in price when something is showed off accordingly, when it's presented to the right person.
Mhm.
You're buying these things for, I mean, not pennies on a dollar, but like knowing what they're worth, it's pretty incredible. So I think
Yeah.
I mean, it's so much fun stuff there.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you an example. I was in Alabama in January or February, happened upon a store that, I spotted a couple of magazines, it literally sitting in the corner. I said, "What's up with those?" And the guy said, "Oh, do you like Sports Illustrated?" He said, "There's 100 boxes behind that wall. If you want to come back tomorrow and dig through them, I'll sell them to you for $1 a piece." And 1,500 issues later, I'm literally I had to rent a truck. I drove home in a day. But that's a collection that came out of nowhere, and I've been able to parlay that into some really big things. Both from a personal collection standpoint, but then also being able to flip some of these things. So again, it could happen at a moment's notice. That's part of the thrill of going into a store, and you just don't know what's going to be around the corner. And that's what I've enjoyed. As especially, as I mentioned, it's become more difficult. As more and more people learn about the space. But it's part of the thrill of the hunt.
That's so interesting because it's still in its infancy, and the people who are in the space are quite passionate about it. Do you think that other issues, so if you were to have like a bunch of, let's say, traders, would that be worth more than like liquid cash in most cases? Like if you were to able to offer someone something that would really enhance their collection, do you think that or is it strictly like, do you still see a lot of cash transactions in
It's a little bit of both,
okay.
and I've been involved with both. Sometimes again, I mean, these things have gotten really expensive in some cases, and so sometimes it's easier to do a little cash trade deal.
Yeah.
Maybe if you're not as liquid, but um, the- especially with the auction houses, that's where there's more and more eyeballs that are coming into this space as some of these magazines are selling. The highest one to date as we record this happened, I want to say it was about 6 months ago, but it was Michael Jordan's first Bulls cover, and that sold for 125,000. Absolutely shattered the record. And to give you an idea of how the valuations have climbed, 3 years ago, I had the record for the highest sold magazine. It was Jim Brown's first cover, football player from 1960. I sold that for 13,500. That was the record, and it stood for about 8 months. So between that point and then 6 months ago, and a Jordan sells for 125,000, and now there's been a good handful of magazines that have sold in that 20 to $40,000 range. That just gives you an idea of the explosion that we've seen in the demand, in the awareness of this space, and so it's been really interesting to study that, kind of see where the next trend is going to be, where are people looking and looking to invest, because that's the other part that is driving this is you're starting to see some investors come into the space, people that have been involved in cards or that type of thing are suddenly realizing, hey, this could be kind of an alternate asset to their portfolios.
Yeah. And there's just a lot of parallels with so many different segments of the market, right? Like I find that, I mean, I collected magazines growing up, like I didn't have autograph magazines, but definitely
Yeah,
like if my favorite athlete was on a magazine cover, like I would keep that cover. Um, up until probably like my last two or three moves, like I held on to those things for quite some time. Now, of course, my last two or three moves were probably like 7 or 8 years ago. So like I kind of
yeah.
missed the boat on some of those things. But there was, yeah, like ticket stubs for me is something that I revisited, and I'm like, I see so many parallels in the sports card space. There's just there's so many different wonderful segments of the market, and I find that like once we're in it, you're like, oh wait, I actually really liked collecting these when I grew up,
Yeah.
and there's like a new thing to look for. Because like I can go to a flea market and look for sports cards, look for tickets, look for magazines. Do you know what I mean? I can look for all of these things that I'm passionate about in the
Yeah.
same place generally, right? Like if you go antiquing, it's the same thing. You're like, oh, there's no vintage sports cards here, but maybe they have tickets. Maybe they have,
Yeah.
maybe I collect vintage yo-yos or you know what I mean? Like there's
Yeah.
always everyone collects something. So just
Yeah.
adding something to that list, although it might be very expensive, it
Yep.
definitely kind of enriches your own personal experience when it comes to collecting.
Yeah, a lot of it is frankly driven by nostalgia.
Yeah.
It's what did you enjoy as a kid or early adulthood, and now you're middle aged and you have disposable income, and part of it is kind of reliving that a little bit. And I
Yeah.
think that could could be said for any segment of the sports collectibles world. It's I want the baseball bat from my favorite baseball player growing up, and now I can afford it. And so
Yeah.
that's ultimately I think what drives a lot of it, no matter what segment we're talking about.
So I got another a pretty interesting question, actually, I think. So you said that Michael Jordan recently sold for over $100,000.
Mm-hmm.
Before that sale, was that a piece that you desired? Or like does it make it now desirable on your part knowing that it's that expensive? Like how does that work?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's been one of the most popular pieces, since the beginning. And so it was always one that I looked for more from an investment standpoint than
Okay.
a personal collection standpoint. And
Okay.
I've been fortunate to find a couple of the issues. Not This was graded at 9.8, and
Yeah.
we should actually talk a little bit about the grading scale. So CGC is the current grader of magazines, and they're also again huge in the comic book
Comic
space.
books. Yeah.
9.8 has been the highest out of a scale of 10. That's where they tend to stop.
Yeah.
And I'll talk a little bit about a couple of issues that have actually come in higher than that. But this Jordan that we're talking about was a 9.8, which is the equivalent of a PSA 10. And so I've known that that's a popular issue. The different issues that are kind of the king of the mountain,
Yeah.
and so I'm always on the outlook for those, more from an investment standpoint than I want this for my personal collection.
Fair.
So but I always say, and I would say this for any segment, it's at the end of the day, collect what you like,
Yeah.
because valuations, things could change at a moment's notice, and you could be stuck with things, and so hopefully you like them. But
Yeah.
I've been able to diversify my collection between, again, what I like, and then when I do spot something or see an opportunity to maybe invest in something that I know is going to appreciate, then I jump at that. But that's it, you've got that Jordan cover, Jordan's first cover, Gretzky's first cover from 1981 is again part of that Mount Rushmore. Muhammad Ali's first cover, and then Mickey Mantle's first cover. Those are kind of the four issues that are the king of everything, and then everything else kind of falls in line behind that. So but at the end of the day, collect what you want, and that's what's ultimately going to drive things too.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, especially when it comes to like a niche space. Like we said at the beginning of the podcast, one of the reasons why you've been able to be successful in the space is because you went in and you're just kind of like, oh, I just really like this stuff. I'm gonna
Yeah.
buy a bunch of stuff that I think is interesting. And
Hmm.
then, fast forward a few years and you're like, holy shit, like other people think these are worth something too, right?
Yeah.
So like that's why I love that, we're having this discussion.
Yeah.
We were talking a little bit about the grading scale. I mean, you want to jump in a little bit about that? So, what would be considered like a really like a pristine copy? You said 9.8. That seems to be like the upper echelon.
Yeah.
If you were getting like a 7 or an 8, like is there like a big discrepancy between that and then like a 9.8?
So it again, it depends on the issue.
Okay.
So 9.8 is, the cream of the crop. Now I will say, in the last couple of months, for the first time ever in February, a Sports Illustrated graded at 9.9. It was an Mbappe first cover, soccer player. And coincidentally, I was the one that pressed that. I was the one that graded it, and I got that grade, and it raised the threshold. It was something nobody ever thought they would see. And so I got that 9.9. And then about a month ago, there was a Slam magazine, basketball magazine of Caitlin Clark, that also hit 9.9. So out of the 35,000 magazines, sports magazines, those are the only two magazines that have ever graded higher than 9.8. So, for all intents and purposes, what we're talking about here, 9.8 is the absolute top. Now, I say that those four magazines I just rattled off as kind of being the top of the heap. You get those in any grade, between 8.0 and 9.8. You're going to be doing really well. And then also, those issues have become more and more popular in subscription format, because they're so expensive,
Yeah.
at the higher echelon and newsstand. People still want one, and they'll buy them at subscription. So you're starting to see some demand, build for really well graded subscription issues. So, yeah, but that's the grading scale. And the other piece of this is, there's not just Sports Illustrated. As I just mentioned, Slam magazine, incredibly popular and growing by the day. Time magazine is very, very popular, not
Yeah.
just sports athletes, but historical figures. Think Steve Jobs with Apple. Think the Beatles. Think some of the turn of the century people that are really popular. So Time magazine is incredibly popular. So it's not just the SI segment. That is the one that drives everything. But any normal size magazine at the end of the day can become very attractive to collectors.
Very cool. You told me there's only 35,000 magazines graded?
Just about, yeah. I mean,
That
at the
is
last, census
insane.
report. So
That
very,
is
yeah,
insane. I mean, PSA does, I don't know, like 350,000 cards a week. Do you know
yeah.
like that? So just to go, like, just goes to show that is the entirety of the market,
That's
35,000.
it.
Like, that is,
And that's one of the things that, when I talk to experts in this space, and what's really kind of the great unknown is, you take Jordan's first cover. I think there's only, if memory serves, I think there's only five that are graded at the highest, and compare that to his, Fleer rookie, which has how many PSA 10s.
yeah.
So the rarity of these things is exceptional, especially when you compare it to cards. And, that's also kind of the great unknown. And I think also what's driving some of the value is, they're impossible to find. So,
I also think that there's like some nuances with cards that aren't there with magazines. Do you know, like magazines are in dentist offices
yeah,
and like they're like everyone has seen magazines everywhere for the
yeah.
last 30 years. I mean, they've definitely come down a little bit, obviously. And I think
Mhm.
that also kind of adds to it, right? Where now a lot of magazine subscriptions are online or that they're paid like literally paid subscriptions to websites and
Yeah.
URL links. And as we start to see printing go down on some of these magazines, like, I mean, the nostalgia factor kind of comes back.
100%. Yeah. And I think that's a lot of it, again, that kind of drives it. Is you do, you remember reading this magazine at school or whatnot when they would hand it out. That's the other thing though that I like about this. And, I collect some cards, and, I
Yeah.
mainly collect it not for investment purposes. I just collect people that I like. And, the one thing that about the modern cards is, I think there's a lot of manufactured scarcity, whether it's numbering a card or whatnot. Magazines, in a lot of ways, like it's like vintage cards. It's, you find one in the wild. It's like finding a great vintage card, and that's also part of the fun that I think is that it's very authentic when it comes to that. And you think about a newsstand magazine that survived being at the newsstand, being brought home, being put on the coffee table, and God knows what,
Yeah.
and then put in a basement for 50 years. There's a lot that goes into that. And it's no different than finding a vintage card that's in incredible shape.
Yeah. They all have stories. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's pretty surreal when you start thinking about the shelf life of, or not shelf life, but the life rather of one of these pieces, right? To your
Yeah.
point, it starts on a newsstand, it gets brought home maybe in like a paper bag,
Yeah.
and like with other groceries and maybe the
Well,
condensation from the milk is dripping on it. You know what
yeah.
I mean? Like there's so much that
One of
goes
the
into the preservation of these.
one of the biggest things that impacts the condition of a magazine, there's two things. There's on the spine, as soon as a magazine gets opened, it can break the color of the print, and so that has an impact on it. But the other thing is fingerprints. So
Yeah.
when you think about you're reading a magazine, you're putting your fingerprints on that cover, and sometimes it lifts the paint off or it can put a little bend in it. So when you think of finding a great condition magazine, it has survived all these different conditions to arrive in your hands, and that's pretty cool to think about the journey.
I couldn't agree more. What are some PC items that either you're looking for or that you've recently acquired that you're super excited about?
Gosh, so I guess for personal, the ones I enjoy besides golf, well, the biggest thing that I'm on a mission for is Tiger Woods. So he's got 22 covers. I've got 16 or 17 of them in 9.8. So I'm on a mission to collect all of those. I like collecting Jack Nicklaus. For basketball, my favorite player is Steph Curry. So I'm on a mission to collect those. And then it goes back to the nostalgia, the phase of, I love collecting the ones that I remember as a kid. I love collecting just the cool cover images. They may not be the most valuable, but I love
Yeah.
finding those in pristine condition. So for the personal collection, those are the ones that I tend to hold on to, or, if I find one in better condition, I'll flip it and try to find it again
Yeah.
and whatnot. So, but then from an investment standpoint, it really is, anything Jordan, anything those names I've rattled off. Anytime I find those in good condition, I'm buying them, I'm grading them, and then I'm either holding on to them or I'll flip them.
Is the grading process difficult? Like, are you ever like pensive or like when you send the stuff off, are you like, man, like, because it's a much easier, I think, to package a sports card than it
Yeah.
probably would be to send off a magazine, right? Like, there's way more surface area for this thing to bend.
Yeah, it's almost an art form. And there's videos on YouTube, especially from comic book people, but a
Yeah.
few from magazine people on literally instructions on how to package and send these in. I should talk about pressing. I mentioned that in passing, and then I'll talk about how to send them in. But pressing, so magazines and comics, it is common practice to heat press these, to take out any kind of waves or any non-color breaking blemishes.
Yeah.
It's not altering the state of the magazine, but every magazine I submit gets heat pressed. I do that myself. That's a whole art form to it, and it takes a lot of practice to get to the point where you can do it on a pretty consistent basis. But then yes, packaging and sending them. Ironically, this morning I just sent in 80 magazines to be submitted. It took me 2 hours to pack them yesterday. They go between cardboard. There's backing boards. You got to make sure they don't move around, because
Yes.
any slippage can impact a dent here or whatnot. And to your point, there's a lot more surface area that you're dealing with. And so again, you learn, you practice, you fail, and I've gotten to the point, doing this for a number of years now, that I've kind of got it down, but it takes some work to get there.
Yeah. I mean, it's not crazy to see kind of like how you're doing so well in this market. If we look at even from like a sports card perspective, the people who are scared to submit their sports cards on their own, they go through a third party sender.
Yeah,
That just doesn't even exist for magazines. Do you know what I mean? The population counts are so low on these things.
yeah,
I mean, you're sending an eight like a one time 80 order. Like that's a pretty significant chunk of what's going to be graded next, So
yeah.
I think and all of this is fueled by passion. I think that's what's the coolest part about all of this.
Yeah, there are, I mean, literally less than half a dozen individuals, myself included, who also will submit for other people.
Yeah.
I have people that send me their magazines. I heat press them for them, and then I will do their submission. to make sure it's done right. And it's folks that have been in the hobby for a long time, maybe don't have the time to do everything I just rattled off, or it's people that are just coming into the hobby that, hey, can you just take care of this for me? So yeah, I mean, there's few and far between, but again, I'm seeing that part of my, call it, business grow, because the word gets out and you become reputable, and so I do have a good number of customers that will send me theirs to be heat pressed, submitted. I take care of everything, and away you go. I have the time. My kids are out of the house. It's just me and my wife, and a lot, this, we're all talking about time. I mean, this takes a lot of time to get through it, but
Yeah.
it's what I enjoy doing.
And that's what matters most, right? It's like it doesn't feel like work. It's like the cheesiest thing ever. But like, oh, it doesn't feel like work. But it actually,
Yeah,
like for you, it doesn't. You'd be doing that, like
yeah,
anyway. Now you're just helping other people do it. So is
exactly.
there is your collection showcase anywhere? Can people contact you somewhere if they've got questions about magazines, about your own personal collection? Maybe they have a piece that they want to move, and maybe you're the right guy to move them to.
Yeah, I think the easiest way, email brad.seymour@yahoo.com, but then also my eBay store. I'm Puckett on eBay, like Kirby Puckett. Puckett is my seller name. That's probably the easiest way to reach out to me, and I'm happy to answer questions. I love introducing people to this space, answering questions, and helping. I mean, that's part of the fun of being on the ground floor. So I think those are the two easiest ways to get a hold of me.
Amazing. Brad, thank you so much for jumping on the podcast today. Team, if you haven't heard about them, you definitely have after this. I look forward to hearing all about this in the comment section of all the people who maybe rummage through old stuff and happen to find their own personal magazines, or maybe they went to a local yard sale or a flea market and they came across some really cool stuff. So I appreciate you for helping introduce this brand new, well, not brand new, but this beautiful niche to the cardboard coach. And thanks again for jumping on, Brad.
Really, really appreciate it, and appreciate your platform and being able to promote this. Thank you.
Thank you. Team, make sure you check out Brad, aka Puckett, on eBay. And man, let's all dive into some magazine covers, shall we? Take care, everybody.